To start off, what's CPI? The Consumer Price Index measures the overall price change in consumer prices over a period of time or a specific time or a set time. It's extremely important to keep your eyes on the changes in the prices of a commodity because it dictates the country's economy and other things. CPI and inflation are terms that are interlinked. CPI is an indicator of inflation. In simpler words, CPI measures the trends in price changes which tell us whether an economy is going through inflation or deflation. Let's discuss an example. From 1939 to 2023, the price of white bread has increased by a whopping 3,163%, a $61.37 difference in value. That's quite a spike, isn't it? What's important is to understand that inflation does not only mean price change of a single product, but it's more extensive. It covers industries in similar countries affecting other countries' economies. This brings me to my main point. What's happening in the US, the inflation, and the economic crisis? And can we expect the world to experience the undercurrents? In an article published by Vanguard, the US senior economist, Josh Hurt said, "This is the greatest inflation threat we've ever seen since the 1980s. This quote puts a clear emphasis on how the world is going through a united economic struggle. A superpower such as the United States does not go through anything alone, especially a loss, even a drastic one such as high CPI rates and inflation. The effects are global. We need to look at the reasons that contribute mainly to inflation and high prices. The most important one is the COVID pandemic that hit the world like a truck. Even though the word COVID doesn't seem much of death scare right now, but in the economic world, the scares have just begun to show. Adding to reasons, according to an article published in BBC News, the war in Ukraine, which hit food and energy supplies, made the problem worse, sending inflation to 9.1% in June, the highest rate in more than 4 decades. With the high rise in inflation, most workers' wages are not enough to keep their livelihood satisfied. The purchasing power of the consumers and buyers have decreased, which means the worth of a dollar. Or in simpler words, if I could purchase a CD for $5, that particular item is now not in my price range. IMF's annual review of the U.S. economy shows us that inflation has been driven by rising prices of food and services. When an average man in the U.S. doesn't have enough money to afford a basic living post-pandemic? Can you imagine how it affects the developing countries? Now, countries like US and the UK are facing record-high inflation. The policymakers have no choice but to increase interest rates that directly impact the developing countries. Also, US inflation recently clocked its highest rate in 40 years, and even the UK breached a 30-year high of 5.5%. Also, the US Central Bank had responded to inflation last year, raising interest rates at the fastest pace in decades, in an effort to try to return inflation to the 2% rate it considers healthy. If the economic situation does decelerate, there might be another aggressor decision coming from the central bank, and this doesn't sound pleasant at all for the country with high debts to pay. Now, you must be wondering, how does a spike in interest rates of one country affect the other? Well, the developing countries that have taken loans, their fates are dictated by these changes in the interest rates. Increase in recession risks, ballooning the size of debt payments, and high prices, unfortunately cause a lot of burden on the countries that are helpless. The countries on the receiving end of a loan often have no option because they pay back loans in dollars. According to the International Monetary Fund, around 40% of the world's transactions are done in dollars. If the dollar price goes up, the worries of a common man go up too. So next time someone in your family member is raging about the increase in dollar price, instead of getting annoyed at the fuss, grab a seat and console them. Even the countries importing goods from the US will now import products at a much higher price. Interesting or devastating? How a globally reputed economy can make or break another country's foundation. Can we call it the curse of the US economy? I'm sure it's clear by now the power the US dollar holds. Most of the world's export and import is done in dollars, so when the prices fluctuate, not only does the United States suffer, but so does the rest of the world. This unfortunately creates a loop of poverty for the underdeveloped countries that become increasingly unlikely to ever break through from the shackles of debt. But contrary to what people believe, because of current inflation, the value of the dollar has increased dramatically, making everyone believe, locally or internationally, that the value will remain unshakable. However, These high rates of inflation are destructive to a country's economy, and they will most likely do everything possible to avoid recession and stop inflation. This piece of information helps me introduce a new concept: time value of money. Time value of money is basically when a country goes through inflation and increased prices which enable the purchasing power of the currency dropping down. It's important to remember that the increased value of the currency, which in this case is the dollar, is a consequence of inflation. So, let's say, in about a few years, the same money so valuable to you right now will have its value decrease in the future. Summing up, as of the 12th of January 2023, reported by BBC News, U.S. inflation was 6.5% over the 12 months to the end of December, down from 7.1% in November, the U.S. Labor Department said. It was recorded that some items such as oranges and bananas even saw outright price falls in December compared with November. The prices for petrol were 1.5% lower in December compared with a year earlier. Costs for used cars and trucks also fell 8.8% year-on-year. Further adding to this, overall, prices slipped 0.1% over the month, driven by the fall in petrol prices. As a response to this, President Joe Biden celebrated the report. "We're clearly moving in the right direction," he said. "It all adds up to a real break for consumers, more breathing room for families." So, is this for real? The other side of the coin indicates otherwise. Clothing prices, for example, rose 0.5% from November to December, and were up 2.9% compared with a year earlier. The only thing believable is that U.S. is trying everything in their power to rise above the inflation crisis. But the process is slower than expected and will surely take its due time. Goods deflation isn't broadening out quite as quickly as we expected. Let's talk about some effects the locals would be facing with this current situation. In an article published on the 20th of June 2022, by Natalie Sherman, BBC News, it was estimated that the average rate on the popular 30-year fixed home loan has already surged to nearly 6%, its highest level since 2008. For the person buying a median-priced home in the U.S., that means monthly payments have gone up by about $600 since the start of the year. The price of living in the U.S. has increased dramatically, leaving the locals helpless. The common man faces the most hardships in a situation like this. Post-pandemic, the job market has decreased, leaving less opportunities for employment. Big companies like Uber, including Amazon, Walmart, Tesla and Spotify, have announced plans to slow or halt hiring. This further adds to people's trouble with facing inflation. In the same article, analysts predicted the bank risks bringing on a sustained slowdown, also known as a recession. As described earlier, with high prices, increased demand and a saturated market, people not being to afford their livelihood. These factors all point towards a recession. But U.S. is still treading the lines and hasn't completely fallen into a crisis, enough for it to be labeled as going through recession. But it can be feared in the upcoming years, if the progress isn't drastic enough. Thanks for watching.